Muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos. Vamos a tener hoy el enorme gusto de tener por primera vez, first time in Uruguay, a profesor Roger Berkowitz. Es el fundador y director académico del Centro Hannah Arendt y profesor de Estudios Políticos, de Filosofía y Derechos Humanos del Bard College, para hablarnos de un tema que nos interesa mucho, tribalismo y cosmopolitismo, Hannah Arendt, sobre la cuestión judía y el antisemitismo. Un tema relevante y de gran actualidad. Esta actividad la organizamos con enorme gusto en conjunto con la Benaverit Uruguay, así que le voy a dar la palabra para que nos dé también una bienvenida a Javier Galperín.
Bueno, gracias, Hernán. Para nosotros es un enorme placer poder organizar esta actividad. Quiero empezar agradeciendo a Hernán, a todo el equipo del CED, a Alexander Castleton y a la UM por intermedio de la licenciatura de Política, Economía y Filosofía, lo dije bien, que nos acercaron esta propuesta de este invitado del día de hoy, para hablar de un tema que para nosotros es muy importante y sobre el que Benaverit viene trabajando hace más de 180 años en todo el mundo, que es el antisemitismo. A diferencia de lo que muchos pueden pensar, el antisemitismo es un problema que no es para nada exclusivo del pueblo judío, sino que afecta a toda la humanidad. Nuestra búsqueda de construir un mundo con mejor convivencia, un mundo más libre, necesariamente tiene que implicar también la construcción de un mundo libre de discursos de odio, libre de discriminación. Así que para nosotros es un enorme placer asociarnos hoy con el CED, que quiero destacar que ni bien le acerqué la propuesta a Hernán, me dijo que sí, sin pensarlo dos veces, así que nos sentimos muy a gusto trabajando con otras organizaciones y reafirmando nuestra convicción histórica de que el diálogo y el trabajo en conjunto, el intercambio, es el mejor camino para construir un futuro mejor. Así que, en nombre de Benaverit, agradecer a todos por acompañarnos en el día de hoy y decirles que esperamos que esta sea la primera de muchas instancias de más trabajo conjunto por los temas que nos unen. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Javier. También reitero el agradecimiento a la Universidad de Montevideo por el apoyo para tener al profesor Berkowitz en esta actividad y a Piso 40, como siempre, que nos permite realizar las actividades en este salón. Un comentario simplemente antes de darle la palabra al profesor, en la línea de lo que decía Javier. Para nosotros este tema siempre ha sido relevante. El CED desde sus orígenes ha estado haciendo declaraciones y pronunciamientos en distintos temas que ha sufrido el mundo y el Uruguay en los últimos años, y especialmente a partir del 7 de octubre. Hemos hecho muchas cosas, pero me gustaría recordar, por ejemplo, el año pasado, la actividad que organizamos con el profesor Alberto Spetorowski, cuando fue censurado por la Universidad de la República, básicamente por ser judío y por decir lo que pensaba sobre la situación y su defensa del Estado de Israel. Y nosotros lo que hicimos simplemente fue, ofrecerle la plataforma del CED para que pudiera decir lo que quería decir, y organizamos una charla abierta para que él dijera lo que quería decir. Debo decir además personalmente que yo no estoy de acuerdo con todo lo que dice el profesor Spetorowski, pero eso es irrelevante. Lo que queríamos era que su voz no fuera silenciada y que todas las voces que tienen algo para decir, con respeto, con tolerancia y con inteligencia, como en el caso del profesor Spetorowski, pudiera ser escuchado. Y eso es parte de lo que nosotros creemos que el CED tiene que hacer. Parte de la defensa de una sociedad libre es aquello que defendía Stuart Mill en Sobre la Libertad, de que toda opinión, y especialmente las opiniones minoritarias, deben ser escuchadas. Y por eso también es un tema que nos ha importado, que en lo que nos pronunciamos en nuestra serie anual del año pasado, en distintos comunicados, ante distintas situaciones que hemos vivido en Uruguay, y también comparto lo que decía Javier. Nosotros muchas veces en Uruguay nos creemos que las cosas que pasan en el resto del mundo no pasan en Uruguay, muchas veces hasta que pasan. Y por lo tanto creemos que también es relevante hoy y siempre estar atentos, alertas y en este caso con el enorme honor de tener al profesor en el día de hoy, poder escuchar una charla culta, inteligente y que nos va a iluminar sobre este tema. Así que ahora sí, I switch to English to introduce you. It's an honor to have you here in Uruguay for first time. I hope you like our country, and we are here to hear to you.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias. Thank you. Just going to move this over a little bit so people can see me. Is that all right?
Yes.
First of all, thank you. Thank you to the Center for Economic Development, CED, and B'nai B'rith. It's an organization I've been part of and loved in the United States and around the world for a long time, so it's an honor to be here. I'd also very much like to just acknowledge and thank Alex Castellanos, who leads the PPE program, Politics, Philosophy, and Economics program at the University of Montevideo, who did the hard work of convincing me and bringing me to Uruguay, and I'm very thankful. I'm really enjoying my stay so far. I'll just say at once, I apologize for speaking to you in English. I wish I could speak to you in Spanish. This is a personal talk, and so you'll see why, but I'll just jump in. The talk is called Tribalism and Cosmopolitanism, Hannah Arendt and the Jewish Question, on the Jewish Question and Anti-Semitism. I am a cosmopolitan. By cosmopolitan, I mean not only that I have a stamp-filled passport, or that I have lived in different countries and regularly share stories with friends in foreign languages, not Spanish, I apologize, across many time zones. My cosmopolitanism also means more than the fact that I feel at home in a shul, have attended weddings in churches of multiple denominations, and celebrated Ramadan in a mosque in Jerusalem. It is an honor for me, a Jewish boy from New York, to be speaking here in Montevideo before B'nai B'rith and the CED. The setting is also appropriate for my talk about cosmopolitanism and tribalism. As I said, I am, very much like Diogenes the Cynic once called himself, a cosmopolites, a cosmopolitan, a citizen of the world. What this means is that I take a meaningful interest in the practices and cultures of the people who are different from myself. A cosmopolitan engages with individuals, persons, apart from their racial, ethnic, and religious identities. Each person has an equal dignity apart from their historical and ethnic identity. I am comfortable talking to a mate drinker in Montevideo, a Muslim in Palestine, a Jew in Tel Aviv, an atheist in New York City, my home. As a cosmopolitan, there is a sense of being at home anywhere, which of course means that one also is in danger of being at home nowhere. I also deeply value my tribal connections. This means that I take seriously my particular identity and citizenship and celebrate certain deeply felt attachments. I am a New Yorker, an Arendtian, a Jew, a man, and an American, among many others. The sense of being American has changed in the last few months. To say that I'm American doesn't mean I'm a nationalist in the sense that George Orwell defines nationalism, the habit of identifying oneself with a single nation or other unit, placing it beyond good and evil, and recognizing no other duty than of advancing its interests. That seems to be our current definition in the United States. Rather, I'm more closely identified with what Orwell calls a patriot. I have a devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life. Orwell says the patriot believes their people are the best in the world, which on some days is more than I would say. The word tribe has a bad name in certain progressive and cosmopolitan circles in which I happen to live. For many cosmopolitans, tribalism has the aura of prejudice, nationalism, and even racism. Should I, as an American, prefer Americans to others? As a Jew, should my allegiance be to Jews and to Israel over others? If I were a Hindu, should I see India as a Hindu country? If I were a German, would I believe that all Germans must embrace a quintessential German Leitkultur, or leading culture? There are, of course, plenty of examples of racist tribalism. For Hannah Arendt, tribal nationalism is born from the frustrations of peoples in the belt of mixed populations in the breakdown of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Russian empires. These peoples desired national emancipation, but never achieved a state of their own. Without a state or a homeland, peoples like the Jews, the Roma, the Slavs, the Poles, even Germans living in other countries outside of Poland, and Russians living outside of Russia, were rootless and homeless. They had no homeland, so they cultivated what Arendt calls an enlarged tribal consciousness, which means that members of these people had no definite home, but felt at home wherever other members of their tribe happened to live. The rise of tribal nationalism in the late 19th and 20th centuries easily bled into racism. The claim for each tribe was that their tribe, based in blood and history, was unique and superior to other tribes. Pseudo-mystical tribal nationalism is racist insofar as it elevates one's own people as divinely superior to others, who must be assimilated, expelled, or eliminated to solve social and political problems for which they are imagined to be the cause. The word tribe comes to us from Latin, where tribus, with the root of tri or three, names the three tribes, the Latins, the Sabines, and the Etruscans, that originally joined together in Rome. Under the influence of anthropology and the social sciences, the word came to describe native and ethnic racial groups organized around clans or families and headed by a chief connected by ties of blood or descent. Because tribal nationalism that speaks the language of friend and enemy based on race and ethnicity, it sits uneasily in our modern liberal age. The very word tribe sounds a discordant note of racial and ethnic bonds that oppose ideas of cosmopolitan equal dignity and respect for humanity. There is, however, a positive and redeemable aspect of being part of a tribe that goes beyond the fact that we humans all evolved from tribal groups. There is, I think, a human need for what Sebastian Junger calls group-founded solidarity. Members of a tribe, whether Jews or Palestinians, whether they're soldiers in a foxhole or coal miners trapped for days in a collapsed mine, share a solidarity born of having suffered together as a distinct group. There is a common bond forged through pain and perseverance. This may be true to some extent for fans of the Uruguayan football team, but it is fundamentally real for Ukrainians, Israelis, and Gazans suffering from harrowing wars. For Junger, being a member of a tribe offers the transcendent feeling of I do not matter, my group matters, and I will do anything for my group. What happens to you, Junger says, in a tribe also happens to me. If you are hungry, I am hungry. If you are in danger, I am in danger with you. We will get through this together, or we will perish together. Tribalism in this sense is born not only from suffering together, but also from collective joy. Common rituals from weddings to funerals can cement the loyalties of tribal members. So too can memories of a common past and projections of an imagined future. In both collective pain and common joy, individuals forge bonds of identity, of tribal identity, that can inspire mutual aid and meaningful sacrifice for fellow tribal members who we barely know. And honestly, sometimes for people we don't even like. One definition of tribalism is that feeling of solidarity with a group of people that would lead you to die for the members of your tribe. People come together in a tribe. They learn to depend upon and trust one another, and they build memories of past and imaginations of a common future. There is good social science research that ties the epidemics of loneliness and mental illness in affluent cosmopolitan society to the loss of feelings of community and membership associated with tribal affiliations. Insofar as human society emerged out of clans, there's an argument that we evolved in ways that make us particularly oriented towards the need for tight-knit tribal connections. But whether or not one accepts the evolutionary biological argument, and I generally do not, there is something deeply human, I think, about the need to belong to a tribe. Tribal solidarity, quite simply, is something we all crave if we are to live rich and purposeful lives. So, I am a cosmopolitan, and I am a tribalist. For most of my life, this tension between my universalist commitments of cosmopolitanism and my particularist prejudices for my family, my neighbors, and my various tribes has played itself out really as background interference. It was something I noticed at moments. For example, when I read the American thinker Ralph Waldo Emerson, who provocatively writes to the lovers of humanity who want to help the slaves in Barbados, quote, "Rather love your infant here at home." Or his admonition to those who want to feed the starving in Africa, he writes, "Are they my poor?" Emerson admonishes the philanthropist thusly, "I tell thee, thou foolish philanthropist, that I grudge the dollar, the dime, the cent I give to such men as do not belong to me and to whom I do not belong." He would rather give real solace and help to his poor who belong to his tribe than pursue cosmopolitan philanthropy around the globe. We see this very argument playing out in real time today around the Trump administration's decision to cut USAID program funding, his questioning of the aid to the Ukrainians, and his transactional approach to Europe and Canada. Against the foreign policy imperative to spread humanity abroad, Trump and his team counsel care for Americans at home first. Care for your tribe. He doesn't read Emerson, I don't think. But Emerson might well add, men do good deeds and give to charities around the world, not out of goodness, but out of penance for living badly in their world at home. In a world where refugees across the oceans seem to receive more attention than the homeless on our streets, I've always found such Emersonian and Trumpian challenges to my cosmopolitan sensibilities bracing. Over the last 2 years, since October 7th, I have been forced to struggle more directly with the contradictions and inconsistencies in my own ambivalent, and I say contradictory, position. Like all good cosmopolitans, I have been angered intensely by the profound suffering of the Chinese Uyghurs in Jinan province, the Hindus in Bangladesh, the Muslims in India, the people of Sudan, Haiti, and Ukraine, and many others. And of course, the people in Gaza. As much as I think that a share of the blame for the suffering in Gaza lies on Hamas and its leadership, who abuse their own people for political gain, the cosmopolitan in me thinks that Israel has defended itself, something it has every right to do, with a tribal ferocity that dehumanizes Palestinian lives. And yet, I am a Jew. As a Jew, I understand that a world without a single Jewish state is very likely a catastrophe for all Jewish people. In living memory, we Jews suffered a genocide that sought to wipe us from the face of the earth. Most of the Jews who came to Israel came not as settlers, but as displaced persons and refugees, since no other country in the world would open their borders to them. Anti-Semitism is real. It is deadly, and it is very much alive. Since I begin with the belief that a Jewish homeland is a prerequisite for Jewish survival in a world rife with anti-Semitism, and since it is clear that Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran will not rest until Israel is destroyed, it is hard for me to deny the one Jewish state in the world the right to defend itself. I recognize the contradictions inherent in my admittedly tribal position. I am well aware that while most Jews did not come to Israel as settlers or colonists, the dream of a Jewish state did and still does conflict with the reality of Arab and Palestinian presence on the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. I admit with Hannah Arendt that Zionist leaders in the 1940s simply overlooked the native population of Palestinians and Arabs. While Arendt also blamed Palestinians for rejecting claims of Jews to live on the land, she cautioned her fellow Jews that to create a Jewish state with a large Arab minority would mean that the Arabs would be relegated to second-class citizens, and she was right. Jews who know their own history, Arendt warned, should be aware that such a state of affairs will inevitably lead to a new wave of Jew hatred, the anti-Semitism of tomorrow. And she was right again. I neither claim that Jews in Israel are absolutely innocent, nor that Palestinians don't have legitimate rights to a homeland. That I can see there is justice and guilt on both sides of the conflict is not a weakness. I see these contradictions as deeply human. A red line running through the fact that while cosmopolitism may be a future ideal, we humans are nevertheless tribal creatures. I am a tribal human in spite of my cosmopolitan dreams. Rightly or wrongly, I take some solace amidst my contradictions in the fact that Hannah Arendt also was inconsistent and contradictory in her attempts to balance cosmopolitan dreams and tribal realities when it came to the question of Israel. Arendt had, to say the least, a complicated relation to Zionism and Israel. Originally skeptical of Zionism and Zionists, she came to see the Zionists as the only political relevant response to the election of Hitler and the profound anti-Semitism of Germany. In 1933, she was arrested while working for the German Zionists to help collect evidence of Nazi anti-Semitism. In the early 1940s, shortly after arriving in New York City as a stateless refugee, Arendt engaged forcefully in Zionist debates. Writing for the German exile publication Der Aufbau, she strongly advocated for a Jewish army to fight the Nazis, arguing that when one is attacked as a Jew, one must defend oneself as a Jew. She supported a non-statist, humanist Zionism, skewering many Zionist leaders for their nationalist tendencies. Above all, she sought to defend a Jewish homeland devoted to spiritual renewal, internal liberation, and a transformed global order. Arendt believed that by aiming for a Jewish homeland as opposed to a Jewish state, Jews could achieve their Zionist goals in solidarity with Palestinian Arabs. By the mid-1940s, and certainly after 1948, Arendt had broken with Zionism. She rejected the nationalist vision of Theodor Herzl and Vladimir Jabotinsky, viewing the idea of a Jewish state as rooted in a Central European ideology of nationalism and tribal thinking. She argued that the Jewish-Arab conflict could not be resolved through the discredited notion of guaranteeing minority rights within nation states. Instead of resolving tensions, new nation states demanded minorities assimilate or leave, exposing the deeper contradictions of the nation-state system. Arendt advocated instead for what she called a federal solution in Palestine, where sovereignty would be shared amongst the communities, Jews, Arabs, Druze, and others, and governance would be based on cooperation. This, she believed, offered the best hope for resolving national conflicts and reimagining political life beyond the nation-state. Fired by her skepticism of the nation-state, Arendt feared that a Jewish state in an overwhelmingly Arab region ignored the rights of the native population. She criticized Palestinian Arab leaders, but as a Jew, Arendt warned her fellow Jews that Arabs were human beings like themselves, and that it might be dangerous not to expect them to act and react in the same ways that Jews had reacted and acted in the past. Arendt envisioned a humanist Zionism that could lay the groundwork for a post-national world. In this vision, a Jewish homeland would serve as a cultural and spiritual center, not a nation state. It would be enriched by institutions like Hebrew University and built on principles of labor, justice, and equality embodied in the kibbutzim. However, the events of 1948, especially the displacement of hundreds of thousands of Arabs, left Arendt disillusioned. Yet she did not abandon her support for Israel. Covering the trial of Adolf Eichmann in 1961, she expressed pride in the achievements of the Jewish state, even as she remained critical of its politics. She thought the 1967 war was defensive and reasonable, the war in which Israel occupied the territories, and wrote to her friend Mary McCarthy, "Any real catastrophe in Israel would affect me more deeply than almost anything else." When Egypt and Syria attacked Israel again in 1973 on Yom Kippur, Arendt spoke uncritically of Judaism as a national religion and later made a contribution to the United Jewish Appeal. Critical of the fact that Israel was a nation state and scathing in her attacks on specific Israeli leaders, Arendt nevertheless declined an invitation to lecture at the anti-Zionist American Council for Judaism. She emphasized her differences with that group, writing, quote, "I know that should catastrophe overtake the Jewish state, for whatever reason, even for reasons of their own foolishness, this would be the final catastrophe for the whole Jewish people." Arendt's decision to reconsider Zionism, together with her support of Israel, only makes sense given her unconventional understanding of anti-Semitism. Far from seeing anti-Semitism as a relic of religious intolerance, Arendt saw anti-Semitism as a defining political ideology of modernity. So this is the most complicated part of the talk, so I hope I'll try and make it clear, and hopefully you can ask me about it if you don't get it. The idea here is that anti-Semitism is a political, secular ideology, right? And her key insight is that anti-Semitism is a secular 19th century ideology and thus unrelated to Jew hatred. She doesn't think anti-Semitism has much to do with hating Jews, right? Arendt rejects the conventional way of writing anti-Semitism. You know, in most dictionaries, at least in English, they say anti with a small a, dash, small s, no, big S, Semitism, because it's against Semites, Jew hatred. She says instead, it's anti-Semitism, one word, no hyphen, all lowercase, to indicate that it's not about Jews, to indicate that anti-Semitism is secular and ideological, and that it has nothing to do with actual Jews. As a modern secular ideology, anti-Semitism, she thinks, is a form of racism. Anti-Semites are racist because they mobilize abstract ideas that activate a racial imaginary. The Jew. What is the Jew, right? We all have our image. The Pan-Germanists, this group of anti-Semites in the late 19th century, and then the Nazis weaponized an already existing social fantasy about the Jew, according to which Jews in general were foreign and undermining the purity and historical destiny of German rule. But not all anti-Semitism, she thinks, is racist, right? Medieval or old religious anti-Semitism that actually has to do with Jews, which she calls Jew hatred, is not ideological or racist. The tropes of religious anti-Semitism include ritual murder, usury, the wandering Jew, and the fact that the Jews crucified Christ. Not to mention the protocols of the Elder of Zion came later. This kind of anti-Semitism is hateful, but Arendt thinks it's not so dangerous. It is limited by confrontations with real Jews. Jews really were not Christians. They really did at times avoid Christian culture and isolate themselves in shtetls and in ghettos. And they really were bankers and moneylenders. The reality of religious conflict and religious hatreds means that religious anti-Semitism while it could lead to pogroms, didn't lead to the Holocaust, right? It could lead to Christians fighting with Jews because they wanted to actually fight over land or preserve their interests. But medieval Jew hatred did not imagine that Jews were such an existential threat that they should be eliminated from the world. The structure of modern ideological anti-Semitism, as Arendt understands it, is different and divorced from the confrontation between Jews and non-Jews. It emerges in the late 19th and early 20th centuries at a time when many Jews become assimilated to Christian society, and secular Jews are increasingly prominent. Modern anti-Semitism targets assimilated Jews, not religious Jews primarily. It targets those Jews who seek equality, assimilation, and yet also are still Jews. As Jews blend into society, the most urgent need of modern anti-Semitism is to define who is a Jew. And she says every modern form of anti-Semitism lacks the basis that underlay the hatred of Jews, the actual concrete knowledge of Jews that was about Jews. Most modern anti-Semites, she says, never even know any Jews, right? Are the Jews a religion or a nation? Is the Jew a rootless cosmopolitan or a member of a tribe? As cosmopolitans celebrated the universal dignity of man, Jews became cosmopolitans, wandering Jews who stood against cosmopolitans in their tribal backwardness. The core conceptual charge here, labeled by anti-Semites, is that Jews are foreigners. Even Jews who are born in Germany and have German parents and German grandparents and German great-grandparents are still Jews and not Germans. Jews do not belong to the German people, just as Jews today are both insiders and outsiders, wherever they live in the diaspora. The truth that assimilationist Jews don't want to admit, for Arendt, is that the Jews are always seen as outsiders. And when the chips are down in times of crisis, they are hated as outsiders. In Arendt's words, as anti-Semitism proves, we are totally foreign to and despised by that other people on the basis of an inalterable substance. As an ideology concerned with a fantasy of Jewishness, anti-Semitism is, quote, severed from all actual experience concerning the Jewish people. Modern anti-Semitism is held most ferociously by people who never encounter Jews. It is not a product of hatred of those who have another religion or another way of life. It is instead a fantasy of the Jew. And here's the main point that I want you to try and take from this about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism only becomes politically dangerous when it serves as a device for mobilizing masses of people for political ends. Because Jews are associated with the state, because they are of an outdated stereotype of the Jew as the state banker, or because of the stereotype of the Jew as the power behind the state, Arendt's law of political anti-Semitism is that each class in society in conflict with the state becomes anti-Semitic. Any class that starts to hate the state, hate the system, hate the establishment, becomes anti-Semitic, even if the Jews have nothing to do with the state. Anti-Jewish feeling, she writes, acquires political relevance only when it can combine with a major political issue or when Jewish group interests come into open conflict with those of a major class of society. Anti-Semitism is further amplified when the masses moving against the state see themselves as Nazi or Marxist avant-gardes whose claim to chosenness would clash seriously only with the Jewish claim. The point is, these levels of political anti-Semitism are not really about Jews. They're about this idea of Jewishness that becomes a stand-in for either chosenness or for the interests of the establishment and the state. Even as Arendt rejects a statist Zionism because of its racial and tribal entanglements, she continues to support Israel because she knows the political danger of modern anti-Semitism. She recognizes that for the Jews to survive, there must be a Jewish homeland. While the state of Israel is too tribal, too racial, and too statist for her tastes, she understands that the disappearance of Israel would destroy the last truly Jewish political resistance to ideological anti-Semitism. As strongly as Arendt rejects tribal nationalism, she also rejects a liberal cosmopolitan project in which we reject tribal realities and political divisions. After 17 years as a stateless person, Arendt received United States citizenship in 1951. In a letter to her first husband, Gunther Anders, Arendt calls her American passport the most beautiful book. She was a fierce critic of America, as she was of Israel, but she also thought that the United States was the one country in the world that was free from tribal nationalism, an immigrant country in which all people could remain Jewish Americans, Black Americans, Mexican Americans, Latin Americans. She refused to love any people, not the Germans, the Americans, or the Jews. She wrote to Gershom Scholem that while she does not love the Jews and does not believe in the Jews, she does affirm that she belongs to the Jews. It is that belonging to a particularist and tribal group that leads her to affirm, quote, if one is attacked as a Jew, one must defend oneself as a Jew, not as a German, not as a world citizen, not as an upholder of the rights of man, or whatever. The first line of Arendt's essay to her former teacher and lifelong friend Karl Jaspers reads, nobody could be a citizen of the world as he is a citizen of his own country. A citizen, Arendt writes, is by definition a citizen among citizens of a country among countries. We are all members of various nations, so many various political tribes. While philosophers might imagine a world government that is a homeland for all mankind, politics, Arendt writes, deals with men, nationals of many countries, and heirs to many pasts. To dissolve the many countries, peoples, and states in the world into one world state would augur not a world of equality, but a centralized world government holding the monopoly of all means of violence, unchecked and uncontrolled by other sovereign powers. Such a cosmopolitan world government, Arendt argues, would be the end of all political life as we know it. It would be a forbidding nightmare of tyranny. So I'd like to end these very speculative and personal thoughts with a question. How can we imagine a pluralist politics? I have 3 thoughts. Short, I promise. First, plurality is the foundation for Arendt's mantra that there is no truth in politics. And yet we need truth. In her essay, Truth in Politics, Arendt writes that the Latin phrase fiat justitia et pereat mundus, or let justice be done, even if the world should perish, is simply wrong. The world, she believes, is worth saving even if there is no justice. The human world is meaningful even amidst injustice. It's a powerful thought, maybe a bit controversial. But when Arendt considers a revision of the phrase that would read fiat veritas et pereat mundus, let truth be done, even if the world perish, she says that this formulation is more defensible. If there is not some truth in the world, there is no human world. The human world is a common world, a world we political creatures share with others. Such a shared world depends on truth, a truth that is common. But the importance of truth, she argues, does not mean that truth must be secured by politics. On the contrary, truth is non-political, outside of politics. Truth is, as she metaphorically phrases it, the ground we walk on and the sky above us. We cannot live without a home, a rootedness in the world. Truth is tribal, and we need a tribe. Second, in a world of plurality, there will be a multitude of overlapping tribes. We need to learn to live amongst strong tribal commitments. This means that we need to hold on to our own traditions and national pasts, and also our collective visions of a common future. And we need to do so even as we make space for other peoples, other nations, and other tribes to live amidst their own truths and their own traditions. We need, as Arendt says in her essay on Jaspers, to break not with tradition, but with the authority of tradition. Right? We need traditions, but we don't need one true tradition. Third and last, a pluralist politics must emerge alongside a new common world without truth, not through the recognition of rationalist ideas, but by the act of talking with those who are members of tribes different from our own. The goal is not one cosmopolitan norm of world citizenship, but a federated world of overlapping tribal commitments. One of my favorite of Arendt's insights is, quote, "We become more just and more pious by thinking and talking about justice and piety." In speaking with others about justice and piety, even with those we fundamentally disagree with, we build a foundation for a shared conversation, a shared common world. Arendt was actually optimistic on this front. She wrote, "I personally do not doubt that from the turmoil of being confronted with reality, without the help of precedent, that is, of tradition and authority, there will finally arise some new code of conduct. If we just talk to each other, a new code of conduct will emerge." The potential rebirth of a new common ethical ideal is not only possible, but likely. It depends on the courage to speak honestly and openly, absent ideological rigidity. Arendt's biographer, Elizabeth Young Bruhl, wrote of how Arendt spoke of her friends as her tribe, right? And many Jews in the world speak of ourselves as a tribe, but Arendt spoke of her friends as a tribe. She describes how Hannah Arendt's tribe as a little island of cosmopolitanism and pariah consciousness. The word for tribe in German is Stamm, literally the truth of a tree. It is our tribe that places us in the world and gives us a refuge and a home. But our tribe also grows like a tree. It can support us as we branch out on adventures and take risks, but it is a world that we come home to. As a circle of friends, both personal and political, our tribe is much more than an ism, tribalism. It need not reject plurality. On the contrary, only with a strong tribe are we able to take the risks to build a world of true plurality and true cosmopolitanism, a world that aims not at world citizenship, but at the venturing forth in the uncertainty of the public world of tribes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. We have tenemos unos minutos para alguna pregunta. Si hay alguna pregunta del público.
Hi, thank you. That was very interesting. I'm wondering if somebody has ever sort of tried to test Arendt's sort of theory, trying to put measurements on things like, for example, I mean, if I were to summarize things like in a minute, would be, okay, antisemitism is using hatred of the state, let's say, and then fill it with the concept of the Jew or something, and that would become something dangerous, you said, if I understood correctly. So I guess you could try and see whether if there were like certain movements that were against the state, let's say, and they associated with sort of the concept of the Jew, whether that led to the thing being dangerous. So, I mean, as a I told you before, I'm a theorist, and you set up a theory, and then you want to know how you would test it, and I guess you would sort of measure stuff that fills in the concepts that you use, and see whether that happens as a regularity or not along history and across countries, let's say. So that's my question.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm somewhat of a theorist, although I don't know, but I'm certainly not an empirical theorist, and that may be a problem. But I take your point. So first of all, Arendt didn't only think of this in the one example of anti-Semitism, right? So her book, if those of you who know it, The Origins of Totalitarianism, actually concerns two totalitarian movements, and both she thinks operate in similar ways. The Nazi movement was one that she thought employed the idea of racism as anti-Semitism, but the Bolshevik movement in the Soviet Union employed a kind of anti-bourgeoisism, and she sees them both working very much the same way, such that they both are movements in which masses of people seek to destroy the state. The Marxists want to destroy the liberal state and replace it with a dictatorship of the proletariat and then a communist utopia of some sort. And the Nazis want to destroy a national state and replace it with an international Third Reich that would take over the world. In her view, both of these movements were anti-state movements, and they needed a way to attract masses beyond the people who were committed to the anti-state ideology. And she says there are all sorts of ideologies they could have chose, right? They could have chose feminism, or anti-women, misogyny, or they could have chose environmentalism, anti-humanism. But she says the ones that worked and that motivated the biggest masses and were able to make these movements, these anti-state movements, powerful were racism in the form of anti-Semitism and Bolshevism in the form of anti-bourgeoisism. I think there's a lot of ways to read what's going on in the world today, right? But one is to say that there are mass movements of peoples around the world who hate the liberal state all over the world. And those movements have a certain amount of popularity, but they're also looking to expand their base, and they try out other movements. They try out other ideologies. Some try out anti-immigrant ideologies, right? Some try out, anti-Semitism seems to work pretty well still. Anti-colonialism, all sorts of them. And so, I'm not sure, this is not the kind of a theory that can be tested in a laboratory. Mm-hmm. I don't know how you would do that. Arendt is not a social theorist, right? She's a thinker, and she looks at these data of history and tries to say, look, there's been Jew hatred for thousands of years, right? And a lot of people after the Second World War said this was just another example of Jew hatred. And she says, but there were Jew hatred for thousands of years, but they didn't go killing all the Jews, right? It's different. We have to take seriously that this was new and unprecedented. And how do we study it? Well, we can't put it in a laboratory and test it and cut it up and measure it. So what do? Well, we read what they wrote. I mean, one of the fascinating things about the Origins is she cites so many anti-Semites. She reads them. And she says, what they said is, they weren't talking about the Jew down the street. They weren't talking about the Jewish shtetl. They weren't. They were talking about the Jew. And in many of the places where there was the most anti-Semitism, there were no Jews. And she says, so what's driving this? And she says, it's because it was politically powerful. And it worked. Now, how can you prove that? I don't know, right? I don't think it's provable. I think it's a hypothesis, but I haven't found a better one. I'm happy to hear other thoughts. Yeah.
Well, thank you, first of all, for the presentation and everything. It was amazing. The question is actually, tied with, what was previously asked in a way. So we have, of course, the perennial, anti-Semitism, this and everything. So, it's a pervasive phenomenon and everything. So what I want to ask is your take on, how easily it is re-signified, how, it's a porous concept, even because you said, and you're right, it's not the same as, say, the Jew hatred we've got in the Middle Ages, and then, the 19th century nationalism, which is more vindictive and everything. So, in a way, my question is twofold. First, how do you say, or how would you, what's your take on the new anti-Semitism, in the face of Gaza and everything, and, Hamas war and whatnot? So, what does it look like? Is it a strain, if you will, of the 19th century phenomenon? Is it just a brand new thing?
Yeah.
And the second question is, how or why are the Jews, in a way, so easily re-signified, as a scapegoat, if you will? So why? I mean, it could be pretty much anything else whatsoever. But then at the end of the day, you know, anti-Semites always go back to the Jews.
Yeah.
So that's my question.
All right, thank you. I mean, those are great questions. I could be here for an hour to answer those two questions. But let me answer your second question first, right? Again, one of the things I love about Hannah Arendt is she's about as fearless as they come. Should I be scared? No. I know it's football.
Yes.
She's about as fearless as they come. And she says things that other people won't say, all right? And so one thing she says is, she tells a very funny joke. I mean, she doesn't. She retells a joke that was told in Theresienstadt. I don't know, some of you probably know it. The Jewish prisoners in Theresienstadt, which was a model camp put on by the Nazis, put on a play. And in the play, there's a bunch of bicyclists. And finally, one of the characters comes out and says, "Let's kill all the bicyclists." And someone says, "Bicyclists? Why the bicyclists?" And someone says, "Why the Jews?" Right? And Arendt says there's a tendency amongst Jews to say it's just random. It's just a scapegoat. There's no reason. And she says, nah, there's got to be a reason. It's not an accident. Now, some people would say, oh, she's going to blame the Jews, right? That's not what she's doing, and I just want to be very clear about that. What she's saying is there are reasons that the Jews get chosen. That doesn't mean it's right that they get chosen, but there are reasons. One reason is the Jewish claim to being a chosen people. Any other group that wants to be seen as a chosen people has to contend with the Jews. And so the Jews become the most dangerous rejection of their own claim to being chosen. So that's one. The second is even more complicated, or not complicated, more dangerous. It's to say that the real problem is, and that the Jews only become a problem in Christian secular society after the Enlightenment and after the claim of Jewish equality. Because the claim of Jewish equality is that the Jews are equal. And yet the Jews cannot want to be equal, because if the Jews are equal, the Jews will cease to be Jews. They will assimilate to Christian society. And so what she says is the Jew represents this limit case of assimilation, where they, on the one hand, want to assimilate and become equal, and yet won't assimilate because that would be genocide, self-genocide. And so the Jew needs privileges. They need to be able to not work on Sunday instead of Saturday, or things like that. And that this leads to a sense that the Jews get special treatment. And they they also separate themselves. They live in communities, religious communities, and they seem other and foreigners. And she says, look, those are the reasons that Jews become easily blamed for the problems of a society. Don't blame the Jews for it, right? It's the problem of society. But you can't talk about anti-Semitism and not think there are reasons. And so she's very critical of those who say it's just a scapegoating, it's just, it's irrational or anything like that. There are reasons, and you have to understand those reasons if you want to address it, right? You're going to have to actually address it meaningfully. Your first question was, just give me a hint, I forgot it. The new anti-Semitism, good, yeah. Right, I think it's a great question. On one, I don't think there's an eternal anti-Semitism in the sense that there's this mystical hatred of the Jews, right? Yeah, I mean, in Christian society, there was hatred of this, but we don't live in a maybe here you do, I don't know. But in the United States, we don't have a hugely, I teach at Bard College, which is a pretty secular institution, and I can tell you there's a lot of anti-Semitism. And Harvard, a very secular institution, a lot of anti-Semitism. Columbia, a very secular institution, a lot of anti-Semitism. So it's not the same as it was. It's also not, simply the same as it was in the 1890s and the 1920s, where the Jews were seen as sort of a people within a people. I don't think that's what's driving anti-Semitism. Let me state this. In the United States today, and in many countries that I'm aware of, there are two different kinds of anti-Semitism circulating. One is what we call a right-wing anti-Semitism, and one a left-wing anti-Semitism. It's not rare. There's always been right-wing anti-Semitism. There's always been left-wing. The right-wing anti-Semitism is actually closer to the 1920s anti-Semitism, the Jews as a people within a people. So if you look at the man who shot the people at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh a couple of years ago, he was convinced that the Jews were bringing Latin American immigrants into the United States. And he thought that the Jews were the people responsible for, undoing the sort of whiteness of America. And that's very common on the right. And so we have a right-wing anti-Semitism that I think is quite consistent with what you saw last century. The left-wing anti-Semitism is quite new. And I trace it to a very different source, which is the rise of, well, I'll put it this way. Politics on the left from the early 20th century until about 20 or 30 years ago was dominated by Marxism, right? Leftism. And the basic premise of political Marxism was that the proletariat was in need of help, and in order to help them, you needed to redistribute wealth. I mean, it's pretty basic, right? I'm not telling you anything you don't know. Marxism failed as a political project. There's nowhere in the world that in any meaningful way is practicing Marxism, and the left, in a sense, was left without an ideology. The ideology that the left found is post-colonialism. I don't know if that's a word that some of you may not know, but it's something along the lines of there are colonial peoples and there are colonized peoples. And the colonial peoples are bad and the colonized peoples are good. So America colonized the Native Americans, they're bad, the Native Americans are good, and America should give back its land. It's not going to happen. I gather that's not as much of a problem here because there was a bigger genocide here than there. Fine. The point is that the post-colonial ideology basically says we want to blame Americans, we want to blame, the Chinese for what happened in Tibet, we want to blame, the Russians for what happened around the world, in other parts of Russia. And there's good people and there's bad people. And now here's where it's similar. It's an attack on the establishment. It's an attack on the state. And the left is anti-statist in the sense that the state is considered colonial, powerful, and therefore bad. There's no real expectation, except among some crazies, that you're actually going to give back the land. You're not actually going to make the world better for the colonized people. But you feel good about yourself by saying, I'm on the side of the colonized, not on the colonizer. And so what I say is that this is, unfortunately, an example of the left replacing its old politics with an ethics. Instead of a politics today, most people on the left simply are about ethics, about saying, I'm good because I care about the victim, and you're bad because you care about the victimizer. And so this gets to your question. I apologize. Here's a long answer. The crazy thing is that amongst all the colonizing people of the world, right? The Europeans, the Americans, the Chinese, the Russians, the Saudis, the Sunnis, the Afghans, all of them, the one that motivates the left the most are 7 million Jews in Israel
who came there as refugees.
Right? They are the worst colonizers in the world. Now, and when you say this to people on the left, they're like, well, no, I care about the other ones too. Yeah, except you don't protest them every day, right? Why is it that it's Israel, a country of 7 million Jews and 2 million Palestinians, right, that is the colonizer, the most colonizer. Well, I don't think you can separate that from this idea that the Jews are the people who control the world. I mean, I think it just goes back to that basic idea. It has nothing to do with the people in Israel. It has nothing to do with actual Jews. It has to do with this fantasy of the Jew. And that's what I think. So it has an old style. I think it's connected to the hatred of the state, hatred of power from the old idea that Arendt talked about. But it's a new manifestation of it, not connected to Marxism or Aryanism, racism or Bolshevism, but now connected to post-colonialism. It's a new ideology that then finds the Jews as a convenient example.
Bien. Creo que hay una última pregunta por ahí en el fondo.
When you started to talk, you mentioned that Hannah Arendt's vision in Israel was the coexistence between tribes. That's, I mean, it's the Arabs, the Jews, the Druze, or Bedouin, or wherever. But that, I think that failed in countries like Lebanon or Syria. So how does it, what do you think about it, or this position of Arendt's?
Yeah, no, thank you. So Arendt, I mean, again, this is a short little paper. Obviously, there's a lot more to it. But Arendt has a fundamental critique of nation states, right? A nation state is a monster. It's a nation, which we could call a tribe or a people, and a state. A state for her is a geographic entity that treats all people within it as equal. A nation is a tribe that prefers itself to other people. The problem with nation states is that there are almost all nation states, and I would even say all nation states, have national peoples and non-national peoples. And there's going to always be a desire amongst the national people to either have the non-national people assimilate, have them leave, or kill them. She says those are really the only three options. And so she thinks the nation-state system is simply evil and broken and can't be fixed. So you're right. It's not just in Lebanon and Syria. In almost every nation. I mean, in the United States, what did we do to black people and others? I mean, it's been terrible, right? There's very few nations that only have one people, and once you have a minority, it's very hard to give them equal rights because the national people thinks they should be have the highest rights. And so this was her analysis that she did of the failure of the nation-state system in Europe, and she was just very worried that the same thing would happen in Israel, and obviously she's been right to some degree. So you say, well, is there any alternative, right? I don't know. She tried to think of one. She's like, look, we have to be willing to experiment. And we're only going to be willing to experiment, she thinks, if we realize the fundamental evilness of nation states. And so she constantly harps on this in her work. And her imagination of an alternative is what she calls federations and overlapping federations. What she says is, let there be a Jewish homeland. What is a homeland? Well, it's a place where Jews govern themselves, but they don't have a state. And there's a Palestinian homeland, and there's a Druze homeland, and there could even be 3 or 4 Jewish homelands within the area, and there could be overlapping federations. It's never been tried, and obviously it's sort of utopian. And I think, we can say, oh, it's ridiculous. I mean, when I, look, I'm sure many of you have friends and family in Israel or in that area. I mean, people, what are the solutions right now? What are the possibilities, right? You can You can have the Palestinians assimilate, which seems unlikely. You can ethnically cleanse them, which, you know, would be challenging, or you can kill them. Or you can figure out, or by the way, they can kill the Jews, right? There's another option. Or you can figure out a way to live together. And there are a number of groups, you know, things like A Land for All, some of you may know that group, and others, that are trying to experiment to go back to this idea of homelands that Arendt talked about. It wasn't just her. Martin Buber talked about it, and some others. You know, I'm not sitting here telling you it's going to work or it's a great idea. I'm saying to you, I look at what's happening in the Middle East and I say, I see no good solution within the nation-state problem. I don't think the two-state solution works. I don't think a one-state solution works. You know, I'm not very willing to consider the sort of more radical expulsion or extermination models on either side. And so I see an eternal conflict almost with no end in sight. And so, you know, someone like Hannah Arendt says we need to be politically creative. We need to try and imagine new political forms. And that's what she was trying to do. I'm not here to tell you. And I think, by the way, it's significantly harder to do it now than it was 70 years ago when she was writing. I mean, when she was writing this 70 years ago, there were still, you know, Jews and Arabs lived right next to each other all over the Middle East. Many of them got along. I mean, obviously it started to change in different times after the 21 massacre or 28 massacre in Hebron, and then there were others. But the point is, there was a lot more coexistence going on and a lot more conversations, and people lived together. And obviously, and that's still the case with Palestinians in Israel, but it's much less the case between Jews and Palestinians in the West Bank and in Gaza. And I don't know if it would be shocking to me if it could work today, but I know people are trying. I don't have a good answer. That's why I'm an academic and not a politician. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. You let us very good material to think about that, and to go deeper in the thinking of Hannah Arendt. I think that that's a great takeaway for all the people that are here. And I hope that this, your first visit to Uruguay, won't be the last.
I hope so too. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
And thank you for coming.
I very much appreciate it.